Welcome to the Ad Nauseam podcast, where classical gourmands everywhere can finally get their fill. Join us for a delectable discussion of Greco-Roman civilization stretching from the Minoans and Mycenaeans through the Renaissance and right down to the present. And now, ladies and gentlemen, here are your hosts, Dr. David Noe and Dr. Jeff Winkle.
Welcome, listeners, to episode 112 of the Ad Nauseam podcast. My name is Dr. David C. Noe. I am here in Vomitorium South in the basement, the bunker of the Reformation Heritage Books warehouse with my good friend and tremendous co-host, Dr. Jeffrey T. Winkle. How are you doing this afternoon, Jeff?
I'm feeling all right. Some nasty weather about 10 feet above us right now. No,
we're not going to do that.
We're not going to do that?
Remember, no smarch comments this year.
I can't help myself. We've had such a mild winter. I'm taking it kind of personally.
Okay, well, yeah. I can understand that, but it's not going to last.
No, I hope not.
No, it's just it's just a thin spittle on the landscape. It's soon to evaporate.
I'm going to hold you to that. I found myself muttering, that like the 10 feet I had to walk from my car to the door, being pelted by these things coming at me sideways.
Tiny little stinging pellets of frozen precipitation.
Yeah. But
delightful.
Aside from that, I'm doing just fine.
Excellent.
Yeah, how are you feeling today?
I'm doing pretty well. Yeah, it's mid-February now. We got through the Valentine's blues, right? Did you do anything for Valentine's Day?
No, my wife and I have an agreement that we don't.
Wow.
So
that's cold. That's cold school.
It may be a little cold. I don't like this. I don't like the calendar. Telling me what I have to do.
I can understand that.
Right. So birthdays, anniversaries, yes. But
don't be bossing me around in terms of now is the day I'm supposed to feel romantic.
Right.
Now I'm supposed to show my wife attention.
Right. Exactly. It wasn't Saint Valentine himself brutally martyred and gutted.
I think that's correct. It's a potential for lots of funny memes, right?
Yes.
As you've seen.
Yeah.
So with St. Patty's Day coming up, you're going to observe, right? Trick yourself out in green and drink beer and so forth.
Become Irish for the day.
Yeah.
Kiss me, I'm Irish.
Right.
Yeah.
Blarney this and.
I remember living in Chicago. They dye the river green.
Yeah.
It's a big deal down there.
Strange.
Yeah. It is a little strange, right?
So that's another holiday that you won't observe because you don't want the calendar dictating.
I know. Well, I find Valentine's Day a bossier holiday. It comes with kind of this obligation.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. And it just seems kind of manufactured and silly.
Yeah. Mrs. Noe said to me, "You should see the grocery store today. Lots of men scrambling in by the dozens to buy flowers."
Yeah.
And, she meant it as a joke, and so I was about to laugh, but then I had that moment's hesitation of, wait a minute, is there some communication here I'm missing?
So you and
scan.
You and Mrs. Noe don't have an agreement like Beck and I do?
No, it's more hit and miss.
Gotcha. Right.
Probably more miss than anything.
But man, I've been that guy scrambling.
Oh, yeah.
I don't want to be that guy again.
$45 for one rose? I'll take it.
That's right. Exactly. They have you over a barrel.
That's correct. Right, desperation just sinks in at that point.
Yeah.
So what are we talking about?
What are we talking about today? Yeah. We're talking about you today.
Yeah, to some extent.
Right. So I know you don't like talking about yourself. But
well,
you just finished.
Maybe I pretend not to like talking about myself. Okay. I don't know.
But you just finished a monumental project.
I did.
You are translating the works of one Samuel Rutherford, right? Now, was it one particular work? Was it a combination of works? Or?
Yeah, it was his Examen Arminianismi.
Okay.
A Careful Review of Arminianism. That's the working title. And I'm eager to talk about the man, first of all, Samuel Rutherford, the man a little bit. We'll give some biography and background. We'll talk about the work itself, the EA. And then, if time allows, and if you can use your typical interviewing magic to pull some details out of me, we can talk about the process of translation.
All right.
And I don't want to give away the farm, in terms of all those folks out there who want to be translators. I got to keep some secrets close to the...
well, of course, exactly.
Because I'm sure everybody's lining up for this kind of thing.
Yeah.
But we'll talk about that a little bit too.
Excellent. Well, I got to say, before this show, I did some show prep and I did some reading about Sammy, and he was not somebody I was familiar with at all. But I was struck by what a colorful and eventful life he led.
Yeah, he really did.
I was prepared for. I was prepared for a snoozer, another Scottish Presbyterian.
Yeah. Well, wait a minute. How many have we covered? I think this is the first one.
No, I'm not talking about the show. In my experience,
okay.
The Scottish Presbyterians I've met and encountered, both living and dead.
Yeah.
Okay.
They're dowdy.
They're a little bit dowdy. So I was expecting some dowdiness, but there's very little dowdiness here.
No, there's a lot of intense activity and more than a little bit of controversy.
Yeah, good stuff.
We covered William Perkins before, who's an English Calvinist.
I remember that.
Way back when. One of the best titles you've ever come up with, Cranks for the Memories.
Oh, yeah.
Talked about his memory disputes. It's episode 16 or 18.
Way back.
Yeah, we talked about Daniel Heinsius, another gentleman from this era. You can't Dutch this.
He was a Dutchman himself, right?
That's correct.
Yeah,
he was at the Synod of Dort. He was the secretary.
Okay.
A brilliant polymath and Latinist. So there's another guy from 17th century. We got one 16th, a couple 17th. And we may do more of this because what is our brief here at the Ad Nauseam podcast? What is our method of selection or criteria?
Well, it's really anything having to do with the classical world from its beginnings to up to the present day.
That's correct.
Right.
Up to yesterday, even.
We have the broadest of parentheses.
That's very, very convenient for us.
It is.
Isn't it?
But those Latin writers of the 16th,
Right.
17th century, it's kind of your sweet spot right now.
It has become that.
Yeah.
It's not how it started, but it has become that.
Okay.
And I'd like to get into that too. But we have to start with no shout out.
No shout out.
But something almost as good, a corrigendum.
Oh, just one?
Just one. Okay. Yeah, why do you say it like that?
What is our...
This will cheer me. A corrigendum always cheers me up.
Yeah, okay. So what do we got?
All right. So back in episode 110, 2 episodes ago, we were talking about the midnight raid of Nisus and Euryalus.
Yeah.
And we made some passing reference to the story of the conflict between King David and King Saul.
Right.
So David was not yet king, though he was anointed such. And a very careful listener said, first of all, great episode. We loved it. And secondly, you got some details wrong.
Uh-oh. What do we do?
She was very kind.
Okay.
She was very gracious. But, it bugs me because I got to be more responsible than this. And I'm the one who trotted it out. So it's 1 Samuel chapter 24.
Okay.
And so here's how it goes. After Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, David is in the desert of En-Gedi. So Saul took 3,000 able young men from all Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats.
Oh, okay.
He came to the sheep pens. Along the way, a cave was there. Saul went in to relieve himself. David and his men were far back in the cave. The men said, this is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. David crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Afterwards, David was conscience-stricken.
Okay.
So I think as we told the story, I think I was... I lured you into this. It's my fault. But I think I was conflating this with another incident in which one of David's men offered to go steal Saul's water jug or something like that.
Oh, okay.
Or to get some, I'm going to have another corrigendum to go draw some water, right?
Okay.
And I was conflating those two episodes. And it is reminiscent of the midnight raid of Nisus and Euryalus, but not identical. So there's the corrigendum. I hope you're listening. You know who you are.
Yeah.
We try to do right by this.
We've got some careful listeners there.
Yeah, we do.
To keep us on our toes. That's good.
Almost like fact checkers, except we don't pay them.
That's even better. Even better. Yeah.
All right. So the first opening quote.
Yes. I love this one.
This is from H.L. Mencken. H.L. Mencken, Baltimore aristocrat and newspaper man, just incredible worker of words, 1880 to 1956. Those are his dates. And he said, since this is our subject today, the Puritans, here's his definition of Puritanism. It is the haunting fear that someone somewhere may be happy.
That's great.
So that is everyone's general impression of the Puritans.
Right.
Forged primarily by one Nathaniel Hawthorne and the Scarlet Letter.
Yes, of course, right.
The Puritans apparently were, psychologically suppressed, repressed. They kept all their emotions at bay. That's the Hawthorne take. They were cruel and vindictive. They didn't like fun or sensuality or anything.
They took dowdiness to the next level, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Hyper dowdy.
Right.
But not accurate.
No,
not accurate.
Really? Are we gonna get some counter arguments against it today?
Maybe not so much, but just as a general observation. Mencken said this in humor, right?
Do you know the context? I've seen that quote a lot. Do you know the context of it?
No, I don't.
All right. Yeah.
No.
I'm just curious.
It's very funny. He had a way with words, that guy.
Yeah.
An expert in Nietzsche, actually. Mencken
was he really?
was. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
But the Puritans, they're not like that.
Okay.
They had lots of fun, right? The name Puritan was a name given to them by their opponents because everyone who was Protestant in England at the time was interested in reforming the church to some extent, right after Henry VIII brought in the Reformation, and then His daughter Elizabeth reigned for a long time. But people had different levels of comfort with the amount of Reformation that they wanted. And those who wanted a full-on Reformation, get rid of all the old rituals and so forth, clean out the cathedrals, they were in a pejorative way called Puritans.
Interesting. So that's the name that stuck.
That's the name that stuck. It began as a term of reproach.
Right.
And it eventually became their title.
It reminds me of Mormons don't like to be called Mormons.
No.
They want to be called Latter-day Saints.
That's right.
Did the Puritans have no, don't call us Puritans, call us this. Did they
just call themselves the Reformed?
The Reformed,
Reformati, or they just called themselves Fideles, the faithful, or Christians.
Yeah.
But it's funny how the first person to label something in some memorable fashion, they win.
Yeah,
right.
It's true.
If you can label your opponent, now you can parry that thrust by turning something that's meant as an insult into a compliment. And I think the Puritans succeeded in that. But originally it was a term of derision.
Yeah.
Nothing's ever good enough for you. Nothing's ever pure enough.
Right. Well, I think even still you hear the adjective puritanical. It's
Well,
rarely complimentary, right?
No, that's right. You got that right.
Now it looks like we have a second opening quote as well.
Yes,
you
we
want to
do.
share that with us?
Yes, I would like to. So this is from a book by one Robert C. Sturdy. It's called Freedom from Fatalism, Samuel Rutherford's Doctrine of Divine Providence. It was published by Vandenhoek and Ruprecht, the Dutch publishers, in 2021. And it's a poem that is associated with Rutherford's tomb. So here is the poem as it goes. It's an inscription taken from Rutherford's tombstone in the churchyard at St. Andrew's Cathedral in Scotland. What tongue or pen or skill of men can famous Rutherford commend? His learning justly raised his fame, true godliness adorned his name. He did converse with things above, acquainted with Emmanuel's love. Most orthodox he was and sound, and many errors did confound. For Zion's king and Zion's cause, and Scotland's covenantal laws, most constantly he did contend until his time was at an end. Then he won to the full fruition of that which he had seen in vision.
Interesting.
Yeah.
My first thought is that's got to be a fairly large tombstone.
Yes, that's my thought too. My second thought is maybe this guy who wrote this epitaph, could write some limericks for us for the ad read.
He's got the rhyme, he's got the rhythm.
Yeah. My final thought was the last two lines, not as successful as the rest. Different number of syllables, and he's rhyming fruition and vision.
That's a tough one. That's
a challenge.
And that's kind of a lame way to end.
You think so?
If you're gonna have an off rhyme, I would say
put it earlier.
Front load it.
That's true. But the sentiment in the last two lines, he won to the full fruition, the full enjoyment of that which he had seen in vision.
Okay.
So the sentiment is nice.
Yes.
But I guess everyone's a critic, including us.
Right. Now I have to ask.
Yes.
Correct me if I'm wrong. It wasn't that long ago that you were in Scotland, right?
Yes, that's right.
Did you visit his tomb?
Well, you know how time flies.
Yes.
Winkle as we age. It was January of 18. So it's 5 years now.
Oh, man. Okay. So
yeah.
And was this before he was kind of on your radar?
No, he was on my radar, but I wasn't near to being finished with this important work.
Gotcha.
And so I wanted to go to Anwyth, which is where there's a tall plinth, a monument in his honor. That's where he was pastor for about 7 years. Didn't make it there.
Okay.
Also didn't make it out to St. Andrews because it was just the wrong time to drive there in January.
Is it kind of nasty and rainy?
Yes, and we didn't have our own vehicle, my son and I. So we saw Edinburgh.
Yeah.
And that's where he was. And so someday I'd like to go back in the summer and see some of these places.
Yeah, without a
because
doubt.
I think it'd be much nicer.
All right. Well,
All right.
Shall we start a bit with some biography?
Let's do that.
All right. Where should we start? I think we should begin at the beginning.
Start with his birth?
Yeah.
Well, like many of us, he was born at a very young age in the year 1600 in the parish of Nisbet in the county of Roxborough. Mm-hmm. Those names mean anything to you?
No, Roxborough. I enjoy the name. It means nothing to me. I couldn't put Nisbet on the map.
So he was Scottish, and we'll have to be careful for our Scottish listeners not to try any Scottish accents.
We got taken to task for that.
As we've done in the past.
I'll do my best to leave it alone.
Right. So his dates are 1600. 1600 was when he was born. That's an easy one to remember. To 1661. Mm-hmm. So he lived for 61 years. And throughout, we're going to rely on the work of three individuals primarily. And that is the aforementioned Robert C. Sturdy, a gentleman named Guy Richard, who wrote a book called The Supremacy of God and the Theology of Samuel Rutherford, and an Englishman named John Coffey, who is a world expert on the Puritans and on Rutherford in particular.
All right.
So those three books, if anything sounds like a quotation, just in the interest of being honest and no plagiarism, you can reliably count on it coming from one of these individuals.
Excellent.
So this is not original research. We're standing on the shoulders of giants. That's the idea.
All right, before we get into more details about Rutherford,
yes.
I have a more kind of broader historical, cultural question for you, because this is an era and an area that I don't know a lot about. But I remember a number of years, 20 years ago, I was at a conference at the University of Edinburgh and loved it there, really enjoyed it. And I remember meeting some people, and they asked me where I was from. At this time, I was teaching at the college that shall not be named.
Right.
And I told them the name of the college. They said, "Oh, well, that's a name that will be very well received around here."
Yes.
And I didn't realize of what kind of a stronghold of the Reformation Scotland was.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could talk a little bit, how did that come to be?
Oh, sure. I got to be very brief here because I didn't prepare for this in particular, this question in particular. So I'm going to be brief and try to be concise. John Knox and a number of other refugees from Scotland and the British Islands came to Geneva and studied with Calvin. And then they went back to their home country. Knox in particular went back to Scotland with a man named George Wishart, I think his name is, and began the process of seeking to reform Scotland and purge it of Roman Catholicism as they saw it and introduce pure Reformed biblical worship.
Interesting.
And the Scottish, in some ways, the Reformed faith seemed to be really ideal for them. Some of the severity of the Protestant aesthetic, the simplicity, it didn't win over all of Scottish society.
Yeah.
But there was a time when it was very much in the ascendant.
Yeah.
In a way that it never succeeded in England.
Now, I was just going to say that my sense is that in England, that you don't see the same kind of roots taking. Going down.
Much more strife, much more conflict in England. And I think part of it is the Scots were forming a national identity against the English.
Yeah.
So I don't want to get too far afield here,
right.
And outrun my coverage in terms of my expertise. But I think what I've said is accurate.
Okay. And just one more thing, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you don't see the kind of strife like between the Anglicans and Catholics in Scotland like you do in England. Is that true? Is it
generally true?
Okay.
But there's plenty of strife within Scotland over those who did not want to reform. They wanted to hold on to the Roman Catholic traditions that they had held for centuries, and those who did want to reform and clean out, the cathedrals, and there was an iconoclastic impulse. There was lots of that conflict. But the Church of England, was associated with the English aristocracy.
Right.
And that was a third way that many others were trying to invent between what they saw as the two extremes of Romanism and Reformed faith.
Gotcha. Yeah,
so Anglicanism never had that kind of foothold.
Right.
In the North.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. Excellent. Oh, so let's continue with the biography. So
yes.
Where do we go from here?
Schooling began perhaps at the age of 8 or 9 at a place called Jedburgh. And this was a 4-mile walk.
Uphill both ways.
Yeah, so 4 miles to school. He would have been, we don't really know, he'd have been 7 or 8 years old perhaps.
Wow.
And the education was Latin. Just Latin.
Just Latin.
Basically just lots and lots and lots of Latin.
Okay.
From there he went to the University of Edinburgh in 1617. And the curriculum was divided up into 4 years. There were the first years, the Bajan year, Bajan.
What does that mean?
I don't know,
Bajan,
and I'm probably mispronouncing it.
Bajan.
There you go.
That's what the first year was called.
Yes.
Okay.
And then the second one was the semi-Bajan year.
All right.
And then there was the baccalaureate year and then the magistrand year, the fourth one, at which point the pupil was required to do some instruction.
Oh, wow.
And as Sturdy makes evident in his work, it was still a time when there wasn't a high degree of specialization among the faculty. So it was kind of like the St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland, and I think there's one in New Mexico.
Is that the Great Books curriculum?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
Where the professor is expected to teach everything.
Yeah.
There isn't a high degree of specialization. And so at the University of Edinburgh, you would have an instructor who would teach you Greek, Latin, mathematics, geography, a variety of things.
Man, okay.
And, it has some, I think that system has some things to recommend it, especially at the lower levels.
Yeah.
At the higher levels, you quickly, run out of your depth, I would say, in terms of expertise. But one of the things that it has to recommend it is that it gives the student a model of someone who has broad interest and curiosity. And so there's that bond of friendship that forms if you're not changing teachers constantly.
Yeah.
And I think that can make a student more motivated to succeed.
Yeah. I can see that. I can definitely see the allure of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So just to read a little quote here from Sturdy on page 40. This would be the second year. In his semi-Bayesian year, Rutherford began his study of Aristotle under the expert instruction of Andrew Young. The latter half of the year was spent in the Organon, studying De Interpretatione, the Prior Analytica, Topica, and De Sophisticis Elenchis. Porphyry's commentary upon De Interpretatione was also employed. In his bachelor year, his third year, Rutherford read the Posterior Analytica and the Ethica Nicomacheia, Nicomachean Ethics. He also began a study of Hebrew grammar. In his last year, the magistrand year, Rutherford read more Aristotle, which included De Caelo, De Generatione et Corruptione, Meteorologica, and De Anima. So heavy Aristotle.
Now, do we know from his biography that he went off to university with the goal of becoming a pastor, or was that just incidental?
That's a great question.
Do we know?
No.
Okay.
Well, I'm saying we do seem to know, based on the record that we have, the pastoral ministry was not at all on his radar at that point.
Okay.
Now, a man who was born to parents who could afford an education, they typically had 3 or 4 potential career paths marked out. And this goes back long before the Reformation. This would include medicine, the clergy, law, and then some teaching or letters, right? Those were the typical 4 that were open to you if your parents could afford to teach you Latin. But it doesn't seem like he had any interest in being a pastor at this point.
Okay. Now, in terms of like spoken Latin at this point, has Latin by this point become kind of a strictly literary language? Or
No.
It's still
definitely spoken.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Still definitely spoken.
So, in terms of his what he was learning at school, what was the content?
Right. Well, in addition to Aristotle, we have this really nice quote from Sturdy once again, talking about the classicism of his education. This is page 48, quote, "Other classical authors used by Rutherford include Cicero, Tacitus, Plutarch, Xenophon, Sallust, Herodotus, Seneca, and Homer. In regard to these sources, Tacitus, Plutarch, Xenophon, Sallust, Herodotus, and Homer are used to supply historical examples. Cicero and Seneca's relationship to Rutherford's writing is more complex. Cicero generally receives negative treatment for his refutation of the Stoics. Following Augustine, Rutherford argued that Cicero's attempt to rein in the excess of the Stoics went too far and destroyed any meaningful understanding of God's providence. This defense of the Stoics found in the Disputatio, along with certain positive references found in Rutherford's letters and other writings, has led John Coffey to argue for a Stoic trait in Rutherford."
Which authors, then, just to kind of sum that up,
right?
Do we see kind of the most? So is it Ciceronian influence on Rutherford that is kind of the most obvious, or?
Well, anyone who was learning to read and write Latin would rely upon Cicero,
right? Of course, right.
But having translated now 800 pages of this guy, it is not Ciceronian. We can talk about that and get me all wound up.
Exactly.
Let me tell you.
And you say this as someone who knows a lot about Cicero. So.
Well, who at least admires him a lot.
Okay, gotcha.
So,
okay.
So it was a standard. The point of the quote is there's a standard menu of classical authors, and Rutherford sampled from all of them deeply, even as quite a young man. So this is before he was 17 years old.
Yeah,
right.
It's incredible. Yep.
So in 1621, now he's 21 years old, he became a candidate for the newly created chair of humanities at the University of Edinburgh.
Okay.
So he's finished 4 years of education. He could now candidate for this chair. New appointment, new chair in humanities. This is part of the general reform. The Renaissance got this far north pretty late, but it eventually got here. And now it's time to not just teach theology, but to teach letters, pagan literature. And so they're going to endow a chair. Rutherford's a candidate to hold that chair.
Now, of course, age 21, going after a position like this strikes me, of course, as shockingly young.
Yes.
Would it have been back then?
No.
Okay.
No, I mean, he was precocious. He was prodigious in his learning. He did not make mistakes in Latin in school, according to the biographers. He was very sharp. So it's a little young, but we have to remember that they didn't have a wide variety of subjects, and all they did was study, really. Yeah. And so it's not especially young for such an appointment, but he didn't get it. And the reason is scandal.
Oh, finally the story gets a little juicy, right?
Did you come across this in some of your preliminary research?
I noticed there were a few places that he was kind of gotten some hot water. So,
right.
This is the first one.
Yes.
So what happened here?
Well, so this is Robert Sturdy again, page 51. The position, the chair of humanity, was initially intended for training in law. Though it seems one of the candidates performed better, the judge's knowledge of Rutherford, his virtuous disposition, quote, and eminent abilities of mind won them over. Rutherford was initially awarded the position. Unfortunately, he held his professorship for less than 2 years. Crawford, one of the biographers, simply states that, quote, having given some scandal in his marriage, Rutherford was, quote, forced to demit his charge. So there are two views regarding the scandal. The first is that of John Adamson, who related the charge against Rutherford that he had, quote, fallen in fornication. The scandal of sex outside of the bonds of marriage in the strict Presbyterian community of 17th century Edinburgh would be more than enough grounds for dismissal and potentially worse, as you can imagine. The second view, held by Murray, one of his 19th century biographers, and many of Rutherford's admirers, is that some indiscretion short of fornication took place. To save the university's reputation from an investigation, which would have been prolonged and public, Rutherford resigned.
I see, yeah.
Other biographers of Rutherford simply dismissed the charges outright. Murray takes some pains to establish his case. He notes that Rutherford's enemies, of which were many by the end of his life, never brought up this embarrassing moment in their polemics. Also, the university granted Rutherford, a, quote, an honest gratification at his dismission. Shortly after his demission, he was admitted to theological training and ordained into the ministry. Many years later, the same presbytery of Edinburgh would have known of his demission, elected him to serve as a minister in the city.
Okay, so that all seems to argue that this
is kind of back and forth.
This was a nothing burger.
Yes, yeah. Right. However, that's the 19th century biographer, Murray. Now we get John Coffey, a man with whom I've had some correspondence. I haven't met him. Mm-hmm. We were going to go to Anworth together and look at some things.
Oh, man. Yeah.
Coffey has evaluated Murray's defense and found it wanting. He notes that the committee appointed to investigate the scandal appointed a successor to Rutherford, suggesting a scandal did occur. He also notes that Adamson, who leveled the charge of fornication against Rutherford, actually sat on commissions with him in the 1640s, which would be 20 years later. Mm-hmm. It is hard to imagine, here's a really telling quote, it is hard to imagine that Rutherford would be willing to serve on a commission with a man who had deliberately and falsely accused him of fornication. Third, contra to Murray, that's the 19th century biographer, Rutherford's enemies did use this incident against him late in his life, describing him as, quote, loose in his youth.
Okay, so that points to that because something did happen. Now, I did read that the woman involved in this did become his wife.
Yes,
is that right?
A woman named Eupham Hamilton.
Eupham?
Yep, Eupham, E-U-P-H-A-M, which means good name, good reputation.
Yeah.
He did, according to Sturdy, Rutherford did have a child with Eupham Hamilton. If he had married her 9 months previously, it is hard to conceive of how such a charge as fornication would have stuck. Finally, Coffey notes that Rutherford makes frequent mention of the sins of his youth, which Coffey takes to refer to the Edinburgh scandal.
Okay.
So the weight of the evidence, says Sturdy, seems to rest with Adamson and Coffey.
But he seems to have kind of come back fairly quickly from that.
Yes, right? That's what's incredible.
Yeah.
He left at that point an academic career. It's interesting that this charge of fornication lost him his position that he held for 2 years in this chair of humanities, but he went right from this into the study of theology.
Yeah.
Where he stayed for the next 6 years or so. And so he completed his theological training in 1627, so that's 6 years later, and then he became a minister at Anworth. So in some way, during that time period, his character was rehabilitated, his reputation was rehabilitated enough for him to become a pastor of the church in the small town of Anworth in Scotland.
Now, where is Anworth?
Right, well, it's way off to the southwest, way far away from Edinburgh, almost on the border with England. Near Dumfries, west of Dumfries.
Close to Hadrian's Wall?
No, quite a ways south of there.
Oh, really? Okay.
Let's see. No, if here I'm looking at the map. If you extend the western end, the southwestern end of Hadrian's Wall, and you go straight west there, you're going to hit Anworth.
Okay. All right.
So he goes off and he becomes pastor there.
Right.
And apparently he was very, very diligent. He would wake at 3 a.m. for his studies. He preached often, usually twice on Sunday. He'd go door to door, catechizing the children and the adults, many of whom could not read, so he wrote a catechism. He'd ask them questions about the scriptures and their faith, visiting the sick, generally performing well in that capacity.
So it sounds like he whatever indiscretion there was, he's making up for it here.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep. Right. Then he falls afoul of the political authorities.
He can't stay out of trouble. What's with this guy?
Yeah, well, he was a temperamental fellow, zealous. He offended the king and was relieved of his charge at Anwyth and committed to house arrest in Aberdeen.
So this would be King Charles II, I believe.
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Now, why was that? What was Chuck upset about?
He had written a number of scandalous treatises and letters criticizing the king's willingness to honor the covenant and so forth made with Scotland, criticizing his commitment to reform and that it wasn't going far enough.
Now, he was also critical of the notion of divine right of kings and wrote about this later, right?
Yes, in the Lakes Rakes, which I think came out in 1644.
So he was already kind of predisposed to not like the royalty, right?
Right, primarily not because he had any beef or charge with monarchy in particular, but because the monarch was not reforming the church according to the scriptures.
Oh, okay.
As Rutherford and many other so-called non-conforming churchmen, they were supposed to follow some of the rules of the English church as instituted by the king, and they were not doing so. And so he was placed under house arrest in Aberdeen, where he was for 2 or 3 years. Then he was relieved of that, and he went to the University of St. Andrews, St. Mary's College in 1639.
So he comes back again. He bounces back.
Yes, each time he manages to bounce back, absolutely.
All right.
Perhaps the most important moment in his life was when he became a commissioner at the Westminster Assembly. And this is really where, my interest and work on his work comes in.
So what does that mean to be a commissioner at the Westminster Assembly?
Right. Well, I'm going to read a little bit here of Sturdy, page 65. The English Parliament's assembly. Now, the English Parliament was at odds with the king and eventually at war with the king. But the English Parliament's assembly had been called earlier in 1643 to produce 3 things: a confession of faith, a form of church government, and a directory of worship. And as a fourth addendum to that, a directory for catechizing. So the Scots were invited to send commissioners or delegates to this assembly. They would meet in London at Westminster Abbey in the Jerusalem Chamber, and over the course of several years, being divided up into committees, they would hammer out these different documents, which were intended to be a guide to all Reformed churches under the British realm.
Oh, okay. And so Rutherford was chosen to be that commissioner.
He was one of five Scots.
Okay.
The others were Alexander Henderson, Robert Douglas, Robert Bailey, and George Gillespie.
Okay.
And Rutherford kind of became the leader of that group by virtue of his learning and eloquence and intelligence and so forth. And the Scots, though there were only 5 of them, had kind of an outsized influence on the rest of the assembly.
Okay.
And because of their work, which lasted for several years, they issued the Westminster Standards. So in your tradition, you've got the 3 forms of unity, the Belgic Confession, the Canons of Dort, Heidelberg Catechism. The Presbyterian tradition has the Westminster Standards, which is the Confession and the 2 Catechisms.
Okay.
So of all the men who were there at this event, they wrote volumes of theology in Latin, enough to fill this room and more. 90% of which has never been translated.
Wow.
And so then I became a part of this project to translate some of these works from Latin into English for the first time. And Rutherford is one of the biggest names.
Okay.
And so that's how I kind of got launched into that. So just a couple more things about the man Rutherford, and then we probably will have summed up his life adequately for our purposes. He at one point received an invitation to teach Reformed theology in the Netherlands, because he had become quite famous now for his works, his writing. He's most famous for his letters. His letters went through multiple dozens of printings in multiple languages. These are letters which he wrote to Christ and to other people. Some of them are very, very amorous, almost in a way that's hard to explain, the way he expresses his love for Christ. It's almost like a type of medieval devotion.
Really?
That you would read from nuns and so forth.
All these in Latin as well?
No, these are largely in English.
Okay.
Very, very popular. In fact, if I can quote from Sturdy here again, this time from page 18, he says, quote, "As Coffey notes, Rutherford's posthumous reputation rests almost entirely upon his famous pastoral letters. His letters have seen over 80 editions in English and over 15 editions in Dutch. They have also appeared in French, German, and Gaelic. A contemporary of Rutherford, the English nonconformist minister Richard Baxter, described Rutherford's collection of pastoral letters as second only to the Bible. The Church of England priest and leader within the Methodist movement, Charles Wesley, commended the letters for the vein of piety, trust in God, and holy zeal which runs through them. The English Baptist Charles Spurgeon declared the letters to be, quote, the nearest thing to inspiration which can be found in all the writings of mere men.
That's incredibly high praise.
It is. Yeah. Finally, this last one. The letters are marked with a style Alexander White, moderator of the General Assembly to the Free Church of Scotland, described as seraphic.
My goodness.
Yeah. I've never read them, which is surprising, but I've never read them. Have you ever read any of Rutherford's letters?
Never heard of them.
Yeah.
No.
Very, very popular. Filled with expressions of love and a deep searching of the soul. Really puts to rest the notion that the Puritans were never happy.
Yeah. Right? Yeah.
Because this is an expression of, as I understand from secondhand knowledge, elevated love toward God and the development of love toward neighbor. So that's where he became really famous.
Okay.
In that kind of writing. He declined the invitation to teach in the Netherlands because he said that his own country had such need of reform that from interests of patriotism, he did not feel like he could leave his own country.
Okay, right. Now are we getting towards the end of his life here?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. So he died in 1661, and let me just give you what will probably be the last quote from our stout friend here, Robert C. Sturdy. Did you get that little pun there? Stout.
I like it.
Okay. So this is from page 72. On March 8, 1661, Rutherford issued his last will and testimony. Quote, I shall shine, he said to his friends shortly before his death. I shall shine. I shall see him as he is. I shall see him reign. Let my Lord's name be exalted. He said, quote, and if he will, let my name be grinded to pieces, that he may be all in all. If he should slay me 10,000 times, 10,000 I'll trust. Rutherford died on March 29, 1661.
Now, as I understand it, he died amidst another one of these scandals.
That's right.
The Lex Rex had got him into trouble. He was being brought up on charges of treason.
That's right.
But he died before he could be brought before Parliament, right?
Yes, he was deprived of his position, again to quote Sturdy, deprived of his position at the university as well as his stipend, and confined to his house, so house arrest. He was summoned to appear before Parliament for charges of treason. Serious illness prevented him. So isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Died, I don't know. How would you want to go? Would you rather be tried for treason and go to the London Tower or something?
I'd rather die and maybe miss that part of the deal. But what a life. He kind of rode this wave of academic and pastoral success.
Yeah, he did.
And admiration, but then he kind of in and out of these strange scandals that
that's right.
Robbed him of things, and then he bounces back. It's
and died rather young.
Yes.
Right? 61 years old. Right, you're cresting 52-ish, something like that.
61 in the 17th century that's not a bad stretch.
That's a pretty good run.
Okay.
That's a pretty good run. Lots of people lived longer.
Yeah.
Some of those life averages take into account infant mortality. So,
right, of course.
If you could get past 5, you might live a long time.
You got a shot, right?
Right, but it was a full life for sure.
Well, speaking of having a pretty good run,
yes,
it's time for the ads. This episode of Ad Nauseam is brought to you by the good folks at Hackett Publishing.
All right.
I was just reading in my class this morning some Lombardo.
Yes.
And I had a student come up and said, we're reading the Odyssey, Professor Winkle. Who would you recommend for the Iliad? And I said, well, how about Mr. Lombardo again? Yes. And I said, it's an affordable translation. It's a great translation. And she was saying to me this morning, I was prepared to hate this. She said, I read the Odyssey in 9th grade, and so whatever translation we used, I found it. I was like pounding my head against the wall, and she says I was floored by how readable Lombardo's translation was. And
wow.
so I had the delight to inform her that he also translated the Iliad, and both of those texts are published by Hackett Publishing.
Right.
Yep.
So this is an actual testimony from a young undergrad in the trenches.
Yeah, just like 3 hours ago.
Exactly. Yeah. Confronting one of the great works of Western literature, and is going to love it because of this great translator.
Yes, exactly right.
Phenomenal.
And it's interesting in this episode because we're talking about translating.
Right.
And that's so important. A translation can be an invitation, or it can be a big brick wall.
That's an excellent point.
It makes and breaks.
Some things that you encounter, you might never go back to it if your first experience is bitter.
That's right. So Hackett Publishing, They've got a great reputation for a wide variety of translations.
Classics, right? South American studies, Asian studies, politics, economics, you name it.
History, religion, they can do it. Yeah, so do yourself a favor. Go to hackettpublishing.com. That's HACKETT publishing.com. Scroll through their tremendous catalog.
They've been in business for 51 years now.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, and with their home offices in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Indianapolis, they just keep that fire a-burning.
They do, and we're very grateful to them for their generous and long-term support of this podcast. And if you, dear listener, you like this podcast and you want to score yourself some good volumes on which to feast, again, go to hackettpublishing.com, scroll through, pick out what you like, drop them in your little grocery satchel.
Yep.
And then, Jeff, what do they need to do?
Then they type in the coupon code, which I believe is AN2023.
2023.
And that will get them two wonderful things, 20% off your entire order and free shipping.
Check it out. This episode of Ad Nauseam is also brought to you by Ratio Coffee. You're beginning a new year. We're now in the second month of that year, Ratio, and I have to ask you, dear listener, what kind of swill are you imbibing?
Seriously.
Yes.
What are you doing with that swill?
Right.
Come on.
Is it bilge water? Is it the kind of thing when you step into a small rowboat, it seeps up around your ankles? Is that really what you want? Is that the kind of coffee you want to put into your body?
Yeah. Is it something that at best could be described as brackish?
That's correct.
Right? Yeah.
At best. So if that's your predicament, let us give you some good advice here. Jeff, what do you think folks ought to do?
Well, I think they ought to do themselves a favor and invest in one of these wonderful machines, the Ratio 6 or the Ratio 8. I've had them both. They're both wonderful. These are, as we often say on this podcast, these are not machines you're going to have on your counter for like 3 months and they sputter out and die.
Right.
These things are built to last, built to be passed down to your children's children.
Right. One of those old machines that you think, it's all plastic. I should probably recycle it, but I hate it so much for the way it's treated me. I just want to run over it with my vehicle.
Exactly. Beat it with a baseball bat.
Exactly.
Like in that scene from Office Space.
That's not what's going to happen with the Ratio 6 or the 8.
No.
They are very pleasing aesthetically.
They are.
And they make a go cup of joe, don't they?
That's they do. Yeah. And it's not just about the joe. It's the experience of brewing it, of kind of watching what this machine can do. Just it's an attractive work of art on your counter. Can't say enough about it.
Yeah. Just this morning I was, getting ready to go to work to teach a little bit of Greek, teach a little bit of Latin, so forth at the seminary, and I thought I don't really have time to use my Ratio. I'll just pick up something there, and that you didn't. No,
right? Okay,
I'm gonna regret it.
Yes.
So I did the grind. I put everything in. I pushed the one button. I went out and came back, and in a very short amount of time, it was ready. It was great, and of course, I didn't regret it.
Of course, you didn't regret it.
You proud of me now?
I'm very proud that you made that decision.
That's right.
So, listeners, if you want one of these wonderful machines, go to ratiocoffee.com, RATIO coffee.com. Pick the machine that you want. And what coupon code should they use?
They need to use AN ad nauseam, CO coffee, ANCO B as in bravado.
Yes.
B4.
B4. So ANCO B4, and that will get them 15% off your entire order.
Yeah, this is a purchase you will not regret.
All right, Dave, so as we get back into it, we're going to turn to your translation of this work of Rutherford's. And so I think the audience would be very interested to know is, how does a project even like this come together? How does it come on your radar?
Right.
Whose idea said, we need translations of these?
Right.
I wonder if you could speak to some of that.
Sure. So the year was 2014. It'll take us back 9 years.
9 years, wow.
And I am at a General Assembly, not like the Westminster Assembly, but similar. I'm at a General Assembly here in Grand Rapids, and I'm sitting next to a world-famous scholar at the time, a man named Chad Van Dixhoorn, who published the Minutes and Papers of the Westminster Assembly. It's a 5-volume, over $1,000 work published by Oxford. It's a monument of scholarship. And for that work, Chad was elected to the Royal Historical Society.
Wow.
And so he's kind of a big deal,
yeah.
Right? And so I'm sitting next to him, and I said, hey, Chad, did you get that email I sent you, 6 months ago or so? He said, no, I don't know if I did. I don't know. And then he looked in his archive, and there it was.
Oh, he blew you off. He ghosted you.
He didn't mean to.
Okay, all right.
He's the nicest guy. He's twice as nice as I am, and a third as nice as you, or something like that.
All right.
And he said, oh, yeah, here it is. And in this I had said, Chad, you're a world-famous scholar. I really admire your work. I have a little bit of ability in Latin. Maybe we could collaborate on something.
Yeah.
And he said, okay, all right. He's just trying to blow me off a little bit, I think. He said, I got this list of men who were at the Westminster Assembly. It's a long list, including their works of Latin that have never been translated. Why don't you start on this one? He just kind of throwing me,
Did he point to one specific one? Hey, you should do this one.
John Arrowsmith.
Okay.
Which I've also translated. It may come out this year, I'm hopeful.
Right.
And okay, so I wanted to impress him, right? I mean, Royal Historical Society.
Come on.
Right. I never made it out of Weeblos. You know who they are? They're one cut down from the Boy Scouts.
Yes,
the Weeblos.
That's right. Yeah.
I never made it out of Weeblos.
All right, so
I thought I got to impress this guy.
Yep.
So I went right home and I worked really hard and translated about 25 pages.
Okay.
And part of my goal was to impress with speed, right? To say I can do this, right? And I sent him a little bit of the Arrowsmith excerpt, and he said, "Oh, this is good. I like it. Let's do something together." So we put together a list of names, one of whom was Rutherford, John Arrowsmith. The others were Franciscus Gomarus, Anthony Tuckney, and Oliver Bowles. These 5 guys. And then we pitched it to that university I used to work for and some other folks. We got a grant. We started in on this. Well, we got John Arrowsmith done, Tactica Sacra, Plans for Holy War.
But how long did that take you to do that?
That of dedicated, focused work, I don't know, 6-7 months.
Oh, okay.
But I wasn't working very efficiently like I did with Rutherford. This was
you had many other duties.
That's true.
Right.
That's the main thing.
Yeah.
But in the build up to this, I started with Franciscus Junius back in 2012, and did that in about 6 or 8 months. And then after that, I did Theodore Beza. I translated John Calvin. I translated some William Perkins. And then I've done some things for InterVarsity where they will say, we have this Reformation commentary on Scripture series, Reformed commentary on Scripture series, and we need these little excerpts translated for the editor to put together.
Okay.
And so I've done 4 volumes like that, but not the whole volume, just little bits.
Gotcha.
But it's probably 150 pages of work altogether.
Okay.
And in that, it's a hodgepodge. So for each volume, I probably translated 15 different authors.
Okay.
So in terms of the number of different authors I've translated, the number's getting pretty high because I've done little excerpts of a bunch of people.
Yes.
And that's good for me because you learn a wide range of styles and different levels of ability in Latin based on the author.
Now, are all of these kind of roughly from the same era?
Well, for that, it's anyone in the 16th century, really.
Okay.
Now, the Rutherford, he's in the 17th.
Yes.
So I've moved into the 17th. And 17th century Latin is quite different. So translating Calvin or Theodore Beza or Peter Martyr Vermigli, these are guys who were thinking in Latin at a very high level. And beautiful, beautiful Renaissance prose. And complicated, gorgeous. The Latin of the 17th century is not like that.
What happened?
Well, the standards of fluency and idiomacy declined precipitously.
Yeah.
And so for several of these authors, you can see, including John Owen, whom I'm also working on, you can see that they're in their minds, they're going from English into Latin. They've learned the books of grammar and composition thoroughly and well. I mean, their knowledge of Latin far surpasses mine or yours, I think. But it's not like the 16th century where they were constantly using Latin as an actual means of communication.
Gotcha.
So it has become primarily literary. And so it's formulaic. My good friend Joseph Tipton describes it as ex sanguis, bloodless. It's a flat, lifeless kind of Latin. And he's right.
Yeah. Would you compare it, ancient classical Greek to Koine? I mean,
yes.
With Koine, it's not becoming just a literary language. But in terms of like its flattening out, it's simplicity.
Yes, okay. I would. Although the only difference in that is, they're still talking about everyday things, everyday affairs in Koine. Yeah. But it has lost some of the richness.
Right.
That you'd find in someone like Aristophanes.
Okay.
For example.
Yeah.
So working on these different authors, then all of a sudden, Reformation Heritage Books, for whom I've done most of my translating, said, we want to release the collected works of Samuel Rutherford. No one has ever taken all of Samuel Rutherford and put them into one series. And so we want to do that. And the Examen Arminianismi, the one I worked on, has never been put into English, and it's got to be a part of the series So you need to get to work on that.
Okay. All right.
So I said, okay, I'll do it.
Okay.
And
wow.
Go ahead.
No, I was according to Wikipedia, which knows all.
Right.
Course, they list 25 or so distinct works of Mr.
Sounds
Rutherford.
about right.
Now, have any of those been translated into English?
Well, many of them are English.
Oh, of course.
Yes, many of them.
Okay.
So his Scholastic Disputation, his private disputations, and the Examen Arminianismi, I think, are the three main Latinate works. Right. And my friend Joseph is working on one of those, and he and I are collaborating on another one. So I'm going to be going back to Rutherford at some point, but I'm taking a break for now.
Right. So how do you feel about that? Right. So I remember talking to you about this, a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
And you were I think you were pleased with how it was going, but it was becoming like a bit of a grind.
Oh, tremendous!
Now, did that have to do
fatiguing?
Did it have to do with just kind of the sheer amount you had to do, or were you banging your head against Rutherford's Latin?
It was both.
Okay.
Right. So if I were translating Calvin, I would find it equally fatiguing the rate I was going, but I would enjoy every minute of it because the quality of the Latin is so high.
I see.
Now, maybe Rutherford can write better Latin. I don't know. But this is highly scholastic, horribly repetitive, jaw-breaking adverbs whose meaning is very hard to trace and track down sometimes. We can share some of those if we have time in this episode. It's just not fun, right? It's in some ways like reading a manual for how to use your lawnmower.
Oh, man.
Can you imagine?
Oh, 800 pages of that?
Yeah. Right. Now, part of the saving grace is that the topics he's talking about are of genuine interest to me. The nature of God, the character of the Trinity, the workings of salvation, the human will and its position in God's providence, the sacraments, all these very interesting topics to me.
Yeah.
But if anything could have driven me away from loving them, it would be the style in which it's presented.
Wow.
Because Scholastic Latin has no charm.
Right.
It has no beauty.
Okay, so that makes the translator's role even more difficult, right? It's if you're saying translating Homer,
right?
You're taking this beautiful masterpiece,
right?
And you're trying to render it into English that's
trying
also
to
attractive.
do it justice,
right?
Yeah.
So as a translator, do you say to stay true to this work, my translation has to be a bit dull?
Oh, that is exactly right. That is exactly right. And, so my friend Joseph A. Tipton, who is a brilliant scholar, and he's one of my go-to guys. If I get stumped on something, I take a screenshot and say, I've been looking at this for an hour. I cannot figure it out. What's going on?
Yeah.
And he'll, fire back something right away, and he'll say, well, I think it's maybe take it like this. And he's invariably right. And he usually says, you got to stop staring at it for so long. All work and no play makes Homer a dull boy, right? And but he says, one of his points is, be sure not to make the author sound better than he is. And in a work like this, it's hard not to do that because I'm always thinking about the reader. How is the reader going to appropriate this?
Right.
And I want them to be able to understand it. So in the 753 pages of English that I churned out, there's a dozen places maybe that are highlighted that I still have to work on, where I said to myself, I'm still not sure what he's saying. There's no lucidity in his writing. There's no clarity. Philip Melanchthon from 16th century, he has a style that's like flowing water. It's limpid. There's never any doubt about his meaning.
Yeah.
And he's very much like Cicero in that respect.
Right.
Just so much clarity. Rutherford had trouble, I would say, achieving that in this work.
Yeah.
Now, in his defense, part of the background of the work is that it was a pastiche that was stitched together from two different sources. So Rutherford had a manuscript that was unfinished in his own nearly illegible handwriting, as one of the editors of his own generation said. But then he also dictated the lecture to his students at St. Mary's College. And one of his students took down very copious notes in Latin in response to Rutherford's lectures.
Okay.
Then a third guy, a Dutchman, Matthias Nethen, compared the two sources and put them together into the final work from which I translated.
So that becomes kind of the canonical text.
That's it, right.
Okay.
Now, I don't really know how much of this is Nethen himself looking at the two sources and trying to make it a connected whole.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because the Latin version of the name Jacob the biblical character, Esau's brother, is Jacobus, right? Jacobus. But at several points in the text, we're given the Dutch spelling of Jacobus, which has a K in it, and is sometimes two A's, right? And that's interesting because that, to me, is a hint that Nathan, the Dutchman here, maybe was supplying a few things.
He's messing with it.
Right, because I can't imagine, I could be wrong about this, but I can't imagine Rutherford using a Dutch spelling of the name Jacob. Why would he do that?
Did your work involve you going to look at the original manuscripts or the earliest manuscripts to try to figure of this out, or were you?
Well, I have the only manuscript. There's one edition that was photocopied several different times. The EEBO Early English Books Online. So I have a PDF of that.
Okay.
I have a couple of other PDFs. One from Amsterdam. I think one from Utrecht. But they're basically all the same book.
Okay.
It was just digitized differently. And at one point, I think it was page 575. I'm pretty sure. I can't connect the two pages. I'm thinking, what is he saying at the bottom of this page? This doesn't make any sense. Now, maybe it was late at night or early in the morning, and then I realized there's 4 pages missing from that edition.
Oh, gosh.
So I spent way too long trying to figure out what's going on here.
So you're working from these PDFs.
Yeah.
Which are they're handwritten.
No.
Oh,
it's a printed text.
It's a printed text. Okay.
Yes.
All right.
But Rutherford had his handwritten edition, then the student's notes.
Okay.
And then Matthias Nathan put the two together.
Gotcha. All right.
And that's the one I have.
That's the printed text.
Correct.
Okay, gotcha.
It's 800 and not counting indices, it's 812 pages.
Okay.
Now the pages are small, right? And there's not a lot of text on each one. So I had to set myself a certain goal per day. I needed to average 8 pages per day in order to finish in my deadline because someone had done some heel dragging because of the many other responsibilities. And so when it got to late October of the previous year, I said, I better get this done because I made this promise and I'm kind of late.
Yeah.
So I charted out a course. I need to get this much done per day.
Yeah.
And that was the fatigue you were noticing.
Gotcha. Hey, I wonder if you could talk about, to get really specific, if you could talk about some specific Latin words or as a phrase or a paragraph that kind of drove you crazy. Or,
yes.
Okay.
I can.
Okay. Lay it on us.
So I was making a document as I went along. I gave you a copy of that there. This is in preparation for a translator's introduction. Because Dr. Van Dixhoorn, of course, he'll work on this. He's a great scholar. But we need to have a translator's introduction. And so I started making a list of words that I found difficult or, hard to define, hard to use. And here's a list just of adverbs. So formaliter, which you could translate as formally, right? But it formally doesn't mean the same thing then as it does now, right? Formally now has to do not with the form of something, but with a certain sense of politeness, right? So you wouldn't use formally in the same way today as you would then. So I had to make a lot of those kinds of decisions.
Okay.
That's a pretty easy one. There's materialiter, no problem. Essentialiter, essentially, maybe. Ministerialiter, not too bad. Reductive, spiritualiter, perspicuae. These are ones mostly I've seen before. But if we get down to reduplicative, right? These are all highly scholastic adverbs. And Rutherford had done his homework. So he knew Thomas Aquinas. He knew the Jesuits like Banyas and Ruiz. He knew so many of his Jesuit contemporaries and older contemporaries. The Bellarmine, the Jesuit Bellarmine, who was very famous Roman Catholic scholar. He's using, quoting, and referencing their works, and thus this is where all of that vocabulary comes from.
Okay.
Indeclinabiliter, which I first took as unswervingly.
Yeah.
Indeclinably doesn't mean anything.
Right.
Undeviatingly, it was really difficult.
Man.
And then there are scholastic terms like in fieri, which means in the process of becoming. In facto esse, right? Which means existing in a finished state. But when you're translating, you don't want to give long definitions for things. You want to find precise ways of referring to the same idea each time.
Right.
And that's where the big challenge comes in.
So some of these phrases you had encountered in your other translations.
Yes.
But Rutherford
were new.
Rutherford, some of these new ones were caused you some.
Yes. So one trick harm. Is that I would just go look to see whether the persons with whom he's interacting, Aquinas, Domingo Banez, and some of the others, who is Gregory de Dominis, if there are English translations of their works.
Yes.
And then I could see how have other scholars taken these particular terms. And so I found some places where Aquinas, from reputable translations, the same word as it's used in Aquinas, here it's being used by Rutherford in what I take to be a similar context, and then I'll just use that term. Because it has already been established as a term of art.
Right.
But that only gets you so far, because there's just so much of it.
And I imagine that's a bit of a headache of lots of searching. I mean, digitally, I guess these things are fairly easy to find, but even so.
Yes, it's tedious. And this was before Chat GPT, right?
We could just do it for you, right?
I don't think so. And then, he uses different words like Romanenses, Pontificii, and Papistae, right? So Papistae is a pejorative term for papist, but Romanenses and Pontificii are more descriptive terms of Roman Catholics. And this is one of the reasons why there are so many footnotes. At this point, there's 2,900 footnotes. Eventually, that'll probably be cut down by a third, because a lot of the footnotes now are just notes to myself. So if I encounter a particular Latin word on page 5, I take a note of it, because when I get to page 405, I don't want to have to rethink it or translate it in an entirely different way.
Right.
Because I want to retain standard terminology as much as possible.
Exactly.
But once I've decided, okay, this is what I'm going to go with, then I can go back and delete it, because it doesn't mean anything to the reader, right? It's just a note to the translator.
Yeah. Now, do you happen to know his famous letters aside?
Right.
In English, is he as kind of stiff as
I don't know.
I
haven't read much of his English, or really any that I can think of.
Okay. Yeah,
I could speak about John Owen, another famous scholar from that era. His Latin is Byzantine and bloodless and rococo, and that's how his English is too. So I think I expect Rutherford to be the same in English as he was in Latin, but I can't say. A lot of this is genre, right? It's the scholastic genre.
Yeah.
But the mark of a great author is to be able to write in different genres.
Yes, exactly. Now, I have a question about even approaching a work like this. Do you say, I got to get a feel for who this guy was? You do some biography work, kind of get a sense of his place in history? Or do you just dive right in?
No, I do that, but honestly, it's somewhat stalling.
What do you mean?
Well, I gathered up a bibliography. These are the works I'm going to read. So I read the Sturdy book. I'm reading the Sturdy book. I read the Guy Richard. I read the John Coffey.
So it's
a little bit of stalling.
You're just kind of you're putting up the
exactly. Come on, buckle down and do something.
Yeah, I gotcha.
But the goal is that the initial work would not be too fruitless and frustrating, or need to be redone, right? Because I want to become familiar with the setting as much as possible. So that the initial stages are, easier.
Yeah.
Right? By the time I got deep into it, okay, I learned the rhythm. I know what I'm doing now. But the first part was, it was hard going.
Yeah.
It was hard going.
Say a little bit about the subject of the work. What is Arminianism?
Right.
And what's he dealing with?
Right. So examen, right, is the noun head there. It's a third declension neuter. It means an examination or a review. It can also mean a censure or a critique. So the working title is Careful Review, because I think that captures examen. But the publisher may decide we need to go with something else.
Oh, you don't have Final Cut there?
No. Do you think I have Final Cut?
Well, I thought you'd have some influence over what the title would be.
Well, I'm going to make a big argument.
Okay.
I'm going to raise a big stink, but I don't think I have the final say.
Okay.
Arminianism is a system of thought named after Jacob Arminius, one of your countrymen, a Dutchman, Jacob Harmensoen.
Yeah.
1560 to 1609. So he died in 1609 in the Netherlands, and he wrote a work called the Anti-Perkins, which was against William Perkins. And William Perkins is that English Calvinist. And what really happened is that Arminius was the leader of a number of men in the Netherlands who began to disagree with the Calvinist view of soteriology, the view popularized by John Calvin, William Perkins, like I just mentioned, Ursinus, and Beza and others, and it has to do with the freedom of God in the salvation of individuals, to eternal life.
But predestination.
Correct.
Okay, right.
And Arminius was quite upset about some of the tendencies, as he saw it, the unbiblical tendencies of the Calvinist system, and he began to write against it and to object. He died in 1609 before the controversy reached its boiling head, which was 1618 at the Synod of Dort.
Okay.
But he had two followers and many others who adopted his thought, who came to be called the Remonstrants, because they issued to the Dutch government a remonstrance saying, here are the points at which we think university teaching and the teaching in the churches should change, because the Calvinists are wrong about some of their views on salvation.
Okay.
One of the men was a man named Simon Episcopius, a Dutchman. He died in 1643. He is one of Rutherford's favorite targets. So he will quote Episcopius all the time. Another one was a man named Valentinus Smalcius. And Smalcius was a German, and he was a Socinian theologian. Now, a Socinian is a follower, it's a complicated story, of an Italian humanist named Faustus Socinus. And Faustus Socinus, or Socini, his Italian name, denied the Trinity. So he was an anti-Trinitarian and labeled a heretic. But his thought continued on and was popular in some circles, especially with this guy, Smalcius. So part of Rutherford's point is to show that the Arminians and the Remonstrants, these are the Dutch guys in the Netherlands responding to Calvin, they are verging dangerously close to and are indistinguishable from Socinus and other anti-Trinitarian heresies.
Okay, all right.
So he will often quote in his writing, he will say, he'll ask a question. This is how the form of the word works. Quaeritur, question, it is asked, or here's the question, right? Then he will lay out a question, which is usually a quote from one of his opponents, and then he will say, the Remonstrants affirm this. So, remonstrates aiunt, right? They say that this is true. Then he'll quote from Smalcius or Episcopius, from Arminius himself, from a guy named Corvinus, or from Dumoulin, one of these other scholars, and he'll quote directly, this is what they thought. Then he will say, nos negamus, we deny it, right? So, remonstrantes aiunt, the remonstrants affirm it. This is standard scholastic language, nos negamus, we deny it. And then he will have 12 points, each of which begins with a quia, right? We deny this because. And in the course of giving all of those points, he will often cite scriptural exegesis.
Okay.
We deny this because, and then he'll give a scripture quotation, and then he'll exegete it. And he'll pull out the implications of each one of these passages. And here he's brilliant. I mean, I wish that he had had time, to publish it himself, that it wasn't a posthumous publication.
Yeah.
In 1668, 7 years after his death. I wish that he had time to work on the style a little bit if he cared.
Cause it sounds like a detailed outline.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
Yes, it is a detailed outline.
Right.
That's partly just the style of scholasticism.
Right.
But there's no charm.
He doesn't get
humor.
He doesn't get salty like some of these guys can with each other.
He does occasionally,
okay.
But I mean, it's so rare that in 753 pages, it's hard for me to even remember a couple of them. I think we should read a few samples here and there, but this is the kind of thing that, in hindsight, I'm going to really enjoy, that I did it.
Yes.
Right? Cicero has this phrase, something like memoria dolorum praeteritorum nobis delectationem praestat. The memory of past sorrows brings us pleasure. So I think it's going to be like that.
Gotcha.
I'm going to look back and say, that torture was so much fun. But at the time, it was just hard slogging because the Latin is so poor, honestly.
You want to give us a couple examples?
Yeah. I'd like to just briefly give an outline of the structure of the work, if that's okay, and then I'll read some actual quotes.
Okay.
So it's got divided up into 20 chapters. And chapter 1, the sacred scriptures and their content. Chapter 2 is on God, divided up into 5 sections. Then there's election, reprobation, the state of the first man, original sin, the state of fallen man, state of grace, universal redemption, so on and so forth, and ends up with chapter 20, the soul and the resurrection of the body. One thing that happened that as I went through the work, with a couple of exceptions, the chapters tended to get smaller. They weren't nearly as long, right? They got shorter. So I'm kind of wondering if he's starting to run out of steam a little bit.
Yeah.
Or if it's just dictated by the nature of the argument itself. It's not really clear to me. The one on the process of conversion, chapter 11, was very long, as was the sinner's justification. And the magistrate, chapter 19, civil government, that was pretty long. But the one on synods was relatively short, a later one. So one of the things I learned is that, coming to this without a whole lot of previous knowledge, I understood the Arminian debate about the nature of election, right? So the basic idea is that Calvin and the Reformed believe God chooses in advance who's going to be saved. Mm-hmm. And the Arminian position is God sees in advance who is going to choose him, and on that basis chooses them.
I see. Okay.
So you walk into a room, right, and God says, I choose you, you, and you, right? That's kind of a very basic, poor example of the Reformed view. Mm-hmm. The Arminian view is God walks into a room and says, who wants to be on my team? Those who raise their hand, he then chooses, because his will is conditioned on their desire to choose him.
Gotcha. Okay.
That's a basic sketch.
Okay.
So I thought that was really the extent of the difference between Arminians and the Reformed on a number of issues. Mm-hmm. But in the course of 20 chapters, there's a whole raft of other issues. And this is kind of just the tip of the iceberg. And Rutherford brought all this out.
Okay.
Deep disagreement on any number of issues.
Wow. Okay.
Okay, so this is from page 194. It doesn't matter that much because the page numbers will change, but it's from the third section of the first chapter, which is on the Trinity. So he begins with a quote, Philippians 2:6, who, referring to Christ, although he was in the form of God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. So these biblical verses stated, and then, of course, that's the easy part to translate. Then Rutherford says, question, is Christ true God, homoousios, and consubstantial with the Father, according to the Arminians' thinking? Some of them make that verbal claim, but in reality they deny it. And for that reason, we consider them, with full justification, as highly suspected of Arianism. So this is a standard course of operation. Here's what they say, but here's what they say elsewhere. See the inconsistency, Rutherford says, and we consider them, therefore, suspect of a more serious flaw or heresy, that of the Arian heresy.
Which would be anti-Trinitarian.
That's correct.
Yeah, exactly. Okay.
So then he begins, point 1. The most celebrated professors of Leiden censure the remonstrance because in their own confession, which should contain their substantial points of doctrine and fundamental articles of the faith, they refrain from using the terms homoousios and consubstantial. So he quotes another one of his allies. These would be the professors at the University of Leiden who were Reformed and, in Rutherford's view, Orthodox. Okay. In their apology, they make no reply, but merely say, quote, they do not wish to pronounce anathema on those who take a wrong position on the Trinity and on the persons of the Son and Holy Spirit. They say, quote, the ancient church kept communion with those who believed that Jesus Christ did not exist except as a man from men. So I never would have guessed, based on my limited knowledge of the Arminians, that Rutherford's going to take him to task for bad Christology. They are so concerned about church unity, you might say.
Yeah.
They're unwilling to condemn someone with an Arian position.
All right, Dave, so before we get out of here, about one more example.
Yes, okay. So this is from the 5th section of that same chapter on God, and it's at the bottom of page 242. Question, does God have sufficient control over free acts because he created and preserves the will, grants it its power, and cooperates with it? So, does God have control over the will because he gave the will absolute control and a free power of controlling that is unqualified by God's predetermination over free acts? Got it? The Jesuits affirm this. See Vergil in his commentary on Thomas Aquinas. Also Ruiz on Thomas. He is not complete master of his estate who cannot grant its control and use to another actor. Thus Ruiz in his work Knowledge of God. Also Raymond in his work Moral Disciplines. Note as well Giles de Koninck, Nicholas Grenkinghoven, and other remonstrants. But we maintain, so here's Rutherford, we maintain that it is consistent with God that his control has no power over the will and its free acts unless that control be from God. Not only no power over the fact that it is a will, but also that it acts or does not act, and that it is within the purview of God's control that a free act exist in a certain instance rather than not exist, that there are a precise number of free acts, nor more nor fewer. This is because, and then he goes through his long list of arguments.
All his quias.
Yes, that's right.
All right. Wow.
And that's not a particularly dense example, honestly,
Oh man.
of his argumentation.
Oh my gosh.
So it's tough.
Yeah.
It's tough.
My goodness.
Yep. So that's what that's what's been occupying me, and we could talk more about how to use dictionaries, how to track things down online, the other kinds of tricks and tools that I use to try to keep everything in order. I'm just very grateful that I get to work on this.
Yeah.
Hopefully, see it to publication in the next couple of years.
To revisit it once it's out. Yeah.
Yep.
Fantastic.
Got the book in hand, and acknowledge Jeff Winkle, who's humor and good spirits and all of the podcasting, sustained me through this.
Oh, excellent. I look forward to seeing my name on that dedication page.
Yeah. Well, in the acknowledgments, come on. I'm going to dedicate it to
that's
you.
right. That's it.
Let's not go crazy.
All right. Hey, we got to get out of here.
Yeah,
though.
we do.
Yeah. So who do we have to thank?
We need to thank Mishka,
Yes.
our sound engineer, who puts this together so nicely each week.
Mm-hmm. Scott Van Zen and Ken Tamplin for the music you hear throughout the episode. I can't say enough about those guys.
Yeah.
Talent.
Generous, talented. Yep. What if they want to get a t-shirt, Jeff?
Well, they should go to adnauseam.com. Don't forget the V. Get yourself a Quai Nocent Docent t-shirt.
Right.
If you want to write to us, if you want a shout out, you can write to Dave at adnauseam.com or
Jeff at adnauseam.com. Don't forget the V there in adnauseam.
That's right.
ADNAVSEAM. I've got some online teaching with the Greeks and the Latins. Got mossmethod.com, latinperdiem.com/LLPSI. You want to do this kind of thing? I can teach you. I can take you from little or no knowledge, from neophyte to
erudite.
That's my plan. So check it out, please. We would really appreciate that. Next week, Jeff, what are we going to do?
Back to the Aeneid?
I think so. Book 10.
Book 10, yep.
We're on the downslope here.
We are. Home stretch.
Yes, declivity.
Yeah, and I believe, Dave, you have our gustatory parting shot.
I do, if I can just find it here in my stack of items. Here we go. This one has comic potential, I would say, although it's not inherently funny. But let's see what we can do with it.
What do we got?
This is from one Clarissa Dixon Wright. And she says, incidentally, although the Cistercians did much to improve the quality of sheep, did you know that?
Oh, the Cistercians were famous for this, right?
Although the Cistercians did much to improve the quality of sheep, the animal remained much smaller than its modern descendants. As late as the early 18th century, a sheep wasn't much bulkier than a Labrador dog. Did you know that?
I had no idea.
Isn't that fascinating?
It is fascinating.
So now, are you hungry for some Labrador or lamb chop?
I can go for some lamb.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening.